Hello, and welcome to Lead Wisely by WonderTour once again. Today we are talking about the movie Oppenheimer. This is our second episode on this movie, and we are going to start right off with a tough question about leadership, as we always do. So I'm going to kick it right to our friend Dave Beltran here and ask you our big question for the day. In the context of designing an organization to pursue not just a goal, but maybe a purpose, which is going to be our theme for this episode, the big question for today is, how do you gain respect from people on a team you are leading who may be more technically skilled than you? What are some approaches you can take? What does that challenge look and feel like? And I'm not implying anything about your technical skill level with this question.
Well, it's never as adequate as I'd like it to be. None of us are as smart as we'd like to be, I think, and that's probably part of my answer. But just to sort of circle back on that question, it's something that I've thought about a lot. So I'm in a position where I have to lead people who have technical skills similar to mine, but probably at some point, especially now that we're hiring younger folks who have been learning all these new techniques in machine learning, know quite a bit more than I do about the methods that are currently being used so successfully. So, and this is something, of course, that shows up in this movie that we love so much. That how do you wrangle together a bunch of brilliant, fractious, opinionated people and do something, in this case, as challenging as building the atomic bomb? The project was a miracle of organization beyond the scientific achievements. It was that's as remarkable as the scientific achievements was the organization it took to make it happen. And we see that in the movie, in the conflicts and cooperations between Oppenheimer and Leslie Groves, of course, but also in the way that the scientists in the lab work together is and in some ways also the political leadership. We see a little bit of that too. So we see some good examples of Groves choosing Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer and Groves developing an incredibly productive and successful relationship despite their differences, different approaches, and different mindsets. And then we see some other, maybe more challenging ones, like the conflict between Teller and Oppenheimer. Although what's not directly said in the movie was that Teller, who would have reasonably led the theoretical division at Los Alamos, was not leading it because he was very difficult to work with. So the personalities that Oppenheimer himself both had to sort of dominate in a way, develop a mastery of the subject such that he could be in charge and be recognized as being in charge by those people, which is a huge challenge in itself. Also required quite a bit of politicking internally to that part of the development. But then the project as a whole, and Groves' role and how it interacted with the rest of the world and the political and military world, is another thing that we see a lot of in the movie. And depending on the situation in my own life, I think I've taken different examples from that movie. So I'm really looking forward to talking about that with you guys.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. I think it's certainly an experience I've had the experience of having a difficult employee or somebody that's the jerk who's on your team is certainly not unique to technical teams, but people that are hyper specialized in some technical or intellectual domain seem to have a higher than average incidence of being somewhat difficult to manage as well. So yeah, that's a familiar challenge, but we do see some really good examples of that in this movie. And if you can imagine, like, yeah, if J. Robert Oppenheimer himself, as brilliant and as accomplished as he was in the situation of having people working for him who were even more hyper specialized and even deeper down the rabbit hole in their specific domains and even more confident in their technical expertise under him, then anybody can have that experience, right? It doesn't matter how smart you are, it doesn't matter how accomplished you are. Anyone can have the experience of, like, you're going to need to leverage somebody else's superior capability in some discipline in order to get a complicated thing done, right? That's not an unusual thing.
And if you're lucky, they don't want to be in charge, but oftentimes they do. So
Yes, right. Or at least they don't want to be supervised, right? So
right, right.
yes, so cool. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started here. Welcome to WonderTour episode 108 on the movie Oppenheimer. I am Brian Nutwell.
I'm Drew Perot.
And I'm David Beltran del Rio.
And we are on a journey to become better leaders by touring fantastic worlds and inspiring lore by going on a WonderTour.
We connect leadership concepts to story contexts. because it sticks to our brains better. You can find out more at WonderTourPodcast.com. So let's go ahead and reintroduce our most esteemed guest, Dave Beltran del Rio. It is our pleasure to have you on here, Dave. You are a nuclear buff, a Christopher Nolan buff, and it is so great to get to hear your experience here. I've already talked to you about the film Oppenheimer for hours and hours at length, as has Brian. So just getting to get this out onto WonderTour, it's just such a pleasure. Thanks for being here.
Likewise, it's thank you guys so much. It's great to be back, and I'm a big fan of WonderTour and all our conversations on these subjects. I'm very looking forward to talking about it more right now.
So, as Brian let us in on at the end of last episode, if you were listening, we are going to talk a little bit more about the beginning parts of the movie here. So we brought up the big question, which relates to how do you manage these brilliant technical resources, or these people who have, I mean, you could even just say people who have skill sets who are very different than your own. At first, it's really hard when you're put in a situation to manage those people. It's easy when you're like, oh, this is a mini me, and like they're just going through the same experiences I went through. It's never just that easy, but it seems a lot easier. Now, in this situation, as Dave said, we have prima donnas, we have people who are, extremely skilled, some of them extremely wealthy. They have all sorts of different things going on in their lives. They have a particular way that they would like to see things done that results in people butting heads. And yet we have Groves, who is kind of our glue guy in this situation, keeping everybody together to save the world and or bury it. Dave, talk to us a little bit about Groves here, and why do you think he is a genius of organizational design, and what are maybe some of the tactics that he uses?
Yeah, so this is one that I've been increasingly fascinated with. When I think when I first read the stories, or got really into this history, I was more on the side of thinking I would someday be one of the scientists, and now I think I'm more of on the growth side of things, I suppose, meaning that more as a, as we become managers and then hopefully leaders, management and organization become central in a way that the technical things that we usually got into these fields for become less important, and that can be painful and difficult. I think that's sort of a well-known thing. But in this case, actually, Groves was put in charge of the project by FDR, and he had just successfully built the Pentagon and wanted to go back and wanted to actually fight in the war, but was given this other project, which was top secret. So the line that they do, actually it doesn't show up in the movie, was that the character Isidore Rabi is in the movie, who was Oppenheimer's friend. He had a line about Groves, which was that Groves wasn't largely considered to be a genius, but that he had a stroke of genius in assigning Oppenheimer to lead the project at Los Alamos. And I always thought that this was a little bit unfair of Rabi, whose standard of genius would have been, a genius physicist or mathematician. Organizational genius and management genius is its own kind of thing. And in Groves's case, the way this story is generally told was that Groves was incredibly driven and ambitious, and recognized that in Oppenheimer as well. So essentially realized that Oppenheimer's ambition to do something great would propel him. And indeed it did. I think that's generally considered, sort of the historical fact. Likewise, the success of the project, I think, led to quite a bit of soul searching by Oppenheimer and a lot of the people involved. But Oppenheimer is in some ways the most interesting one in that, about what that ambition ended up bringing about. Just in terms of the two of them working together, it in some ways it's remarkable that with their different backgrounds and different intellectual approaches and similar ambition, very different skill sets, they managed to develop such a remarkable working relationship that led to the success of that project. It's sort of well told in the movie. I want to hear your guys' thoughts on that, though, before maybe talking about some of the other examples of leadership that we see in that movie.
Yeah, there's obviously a wealth of, sort of nuance and richness of history here. I love that early in the movie, they introduced this concept of compartmentalization, this concept of who needs to know what piece of information. And that's one of the sort of central tensions of this story. And one of, it's a tension that's sort of recognizable in the real world too, of you need people to be specialized. You need people to be focused on their own thing. You need to not necessarily let the people you're competing against know what you're doing, but also you can't, when you're doing a new thing and you don't know how you're going to do the new thing, you can't do it without sharing information with as many potentially powerful collaborators as possible, right? And there's a limit to how much you can get away with. And of course, in Nolan fashion, we've got compartmentalization means something else when you're talking about the Oppenheimer's personal life and everyone's personal life that's involved with this, because they have this challenge and it's on top of them being humans who are trying to sort of navigate in the world. So I want to talk about the compartmentalization stuff a little bit. I want to hear what you guys think about it. But before that, the other thing I just wanted to say was what's, I think, obvious but so striking is this is possibly the purest example of, if you want to do the nearly impossible thing, right? If you want to get the team together and work really hard and do the nearly impossible thing, like, there has to be incredible clarity of purpose. And not just goal, but purpose, right? The goal was figure out nuclear fission so that we can build a bomb. But the purpose wasn't build a bomb. The purpose was don't let the Nazis build a bomb and kill us all, right? The purpose was we have this existential challenge and we have to get there first because we believe the only right thing to do, the only thing, the thing that we can do in the world that no other humans can do is make this thing. And they were aware the entire time that there's some real conflict in that purpose, that there's some real risk in that purpose, but they were super clear that that's what they were going to do and that they were on a timeline and that there was this context for why to do it that allowed them to kind of stop compartmentalizing, that allowed them to just we're going to move our families to this place and we're going to work on this 24/7 and we're going to give all of our energy and all of our emotion and all of our intellect to this because we bought in. And very few of us will or probably should work on a project that's quite those implications. But the extent to which you can take the best available people and unite them around a purpose is very much an indicator of your prospects for success, right? The lack of clarity, the lack of purpose, the lack of being able to select the best available people, all those are terrible for you. If you can move in some steps in that direction, is a very powerful set of levers for achieving your goals.
I like what you said there, Brian, about how we really need to have clarity. And it's cool because it answers both questions, honestly. It answers the question of how do you handle managing or leading really technically skilled people who have a strong will of their own, who have their own imaginations for how this invention or whatever they're going to build is going to work. And it starts with clarity. So it's going to beat individual efforts when you have strong clarity of vision. This is where we're going. Strong visibility on the mission. This is why we're doing what we're doing. If people are not, you have this problem, you're going to have this problem at any big initiative. There's going to be people who don't understand why we're doing what we're doing. You're going to lay it out what seems plain to you or what's plain to other, key leaders or team members or whatever. And there's going to be people who don't get it. So one of the tactics that I try to use is simple clarity to things. It has to be simple enough that I can show this to somebody, take the vision and take the mission, whatever it is, take the values and show it to somebody who doesn't know all of the details about everything that we're doing. And they can be like, that makes sense. I can get behind that. Because otherwise you're going to have so many different people who are headstrong and who have the best of intentions. But if you just leave too much ambiguity in there, that's where the conflict starts to creep in. And that's also where the compartmentalization starts to creep in. As soon as there's ambiguity about where we're going, then the compartmentalization is going to cause fractures in the initiative. The compartmentalization is going to mean that the people who have to work over here, are either going to choose not to work with the people over here. Let's say we always use data science because all of us know about data science, but let's say we're building this new cool predictive model that's going to be able to solve this great problem for all humans, right? Oh, cool. Oh, this is a perfect one, right? We're going to be able to predict if you have enough milk in the fridge or when you're going to run out of milk, right? Have you seen those commercials? They keep telling, because it's an age-old problem that I don't know what's in the fridge. I hate going in there and seeing the expiration dates already passed when I was planning to make dinner or whatever. Necessarily, you can't have the user experience designers who are working on the fridge always, or whatever the applications are. I don't know, your whole ecosystem that you work for Whirlpool or whatever, right? But if you can't have the people who are designing the tech always also working with the user experience designers. It just doesn't work out that way. And they're oftentimes the way that those schools of thought work, the technical engineers and stuff like that think very differently than the designers think. And so it's a struggle to get them to work together. And I think we see a lot of that here, where we talked about it before as kind of the science community versus the military community. But there's other conflicts that you see happen in here, right? Where it's like, okay, how are we going to get these skilled people to work together? And what do we always go back to? We go back to the David Marquet submarine captain video where he talks about there's two things you need as a leader. You need clarity, number one, and you need competency. Number two, you need to have great people that are working on it. And when you build those things, and when you have even amounts of those things, you can achieve greatness.
One thing I want to bring up there is that you mentioned this in passing, but I really want to focus on it a little bit, which was that organizationally, in some ways, the scientific community, the physicists and all sorts of different specialties that were working on the atomic bomb had an advantage, which was that they came from the scientific community, which by that point in the 20th century had developed into this open culture of communicating and sharing information, sharing results. They competed with each other quite intensely in trying to be the first to achieve some exciting or important result. And as you probably all both well know, and most of our audience knows, the early 20th century saw a remarkable progress in science. And a lot of it was due to the fact that they had developed this community of sharing information, sharing data, sharing results, going back and forth between institutions as well. So these guys had all worked with each other in their respective countries and moved around. And for them, it was very natural to all jump in, divide up the work in whatever way was most reasonable given their skill sets and their interests, and work on their own parts of it. This open and sharing method had been developed and is still sort of the standard for science. This was not the way that the government or military did things. So this sort of sets up this conflict.
Yes, and I think this is a really good segue to our mountaintop for this episode. And again, this is sort of the scene or the line or the moment which sort of best encapsulates our lesson. And for me, in this organizational discussion, the mountaintop moment is it's in a montage, but it's the building of Los Alamos. It's the decision to isolate the team, but together, right? And so this addresses both the compartmentalization conversation and the open scientific collaboration, empower the team conversation, and the purpose conversation. Is the answer in this case is compartmentalized to the right size, where all of the people that have to be involved in are not only together, but are together with literally nothing else to do.
You know, and put a fence around it, right? Yeah.
Right, like, literally, physically, they're in a space where they are compartmentalized, so there's it's theoretically difficult to be spied upon, and turns out not so much. But just the physical structure of the place enforced you guys are out in the middle of the wilderness, but you're here together. We have one purpose. We have one thing to do. Within these walls, there's incredible collaboration. They're floating people between teams. We see really good examples from Oppenheimer of okay, great, tell her, go work on your hydrogen bomb. If that's what you work on, do that. We've got people that want to be on different teams. I'm going to move things around so that we've got the best combination of people aligned with what they're good at, and people aligned with the people they want to work with, and people aligned with the stuff that they want to be working on. And those aren't all the same thing. But he does a really good job of that.
Groves wants to internally compartmentalize Los Alamos, and Oppenheimer says, no, it's not going to work if you do that. He knows that they have to share information internally, but he's willing to have them closed off the way they were. It actually ends up setting up quite a weird culture.
It does, but it's the only way to resolve that tension, right? Or it was a very skillful way to resolve that tension of, we don't want to have information leaking out, but we cannot possibly do this job without intense information exchange. So, right, you just put little physical walls around the information exchange, and we don't have an internet, so at least we got that going for us, right? So, yeah, Yeah, so for me, that's the mountaintop here is the, the leadership lesson to be taken is like, how do you put the right size and shape of a team in place, and how do you give them enough structure, air cover, separation, whatever you want to call it in an organization so that they feel like they can act as a team with minimal interference while they pursue the purpose that you've all already agreed that they're going to do, right? And that's, so many of us have worked in these matrixed organizations where you feel like every meeting is a different topic and every email is a different topic, and you're constantly bouncing back and forth between things. As a manager, you can live in that role if your job is to remove roadblocks. But as a creator, as an innovator, as a scientist, as a person who writes code, as a person who does analysis, that doesn't work. Like, you can't do a new thing every 12 minutes all day long and be a creative person, right? You need to do the same thing for some large blocks of time and get the collaboration and support that you need. So how do you set, going back to our WonderTour line of it's not about you, right? How do you as the manager, completely regardless of your personal schedule, set the people up so that they have the maximum possibility to succeed, the best alignment, the best support, the best compartmentalization into the right size team? And that's, I think, a really cool challenge to think about. Like, what would be a Los Alamos for your project? It's not going to be Los Alamos, but it's going to be something other than business as usual. It's going to be something other than, anyway, go to 9 meetings a day.
Yeah, that's one of the controls that you have as a leader and manager is over the organizational design. It's where you have a lot of influence. In fact, you may have some of the most influence over the organizational design versus some of the other areas. And so that's the lever that you have to pull, and to not think that that's a lever, oh, we evaluate that once a year or something like that. But instead to think about that. Obviously, there's limitations in terms of budget cycles and all sorts of stuff, right? But there's stuff you can do periodically, every month, every quarter, whatever it is, in order to constantly refine it. And that's what we see as well in Oppenheimer is they don't just settle for the first idea. It's like, okay, how are we going to make a decision? Well, this isn't a decision science podcast, but there's many different models that we can use, and they all kind of gravitate around the same things. Okay, is it a reversible decision or is it not? Well, a lot of times organizational design seems like it's an irreversible decision, but it's not. How might we set up a test that is not cruel and unusual, right? Where we're not whipping people around, putting them on different things, sending people to jobs that they didn't sign up for when they signed on to do the work or whatever. But instead, we're not just focused on the number of widgets that we're making in the throughput, but we're focused on creating really empowered and high-performing teams, because that's the goal. We're trying to create high-performing teams. When you create high-performing teams, you can't necessarily measure them on the widget output within the first 6 months or something like that. It takes 18 plus months to create a high-performing team, which means you might have to rotate people in and out. You might have to figure out how, the best way to coach those team members, because it's going to be individual. It's going to be different than the last time that somebody coached, a similar team working on a similar initiative. And I think that's what we see here is Oppie really takes a stand for some of the things. Like, he's like, okay, I get it. We're going to have to do some compartmentalization. I understand that. But like, let's try to focus on our principles here. We're trying to build this complicated thing that we don't, the theoretical and the physical have to come together on this thing. So we can't decouple the theoretical and the physical. That will not work. I'm telling you that won't work. And we can't decouple all of the different elements of that thing either, because those elements have to eventually be put together. But maybe we could decouple those a little bit. So I don't know where that goes, but where does that take you guys?
Well, the thing that I like that I'm thinking as you're talking here is that one of the things they took from the military viewpoint that I think, sort of Groves's influence and the fact that, the seriousness of what they were doing is that unlike the traditional scientific method, the chain of command was extremely clear. The decision science it's very clear who's making the decisions. It's Oppenheimer, right? Or it's Groves. It's one of those two guys, right? And in the teams, it was clear who's making the decisions. And that's a thing that wasn't common to the scientific community outside of Los Alamos, but it was a thing that they really took to heart as like, in order to move quickly, we can't be sort of dithering and arguing and wondering and doing things in parallel. We actually have to be very structured about our decision tree. We have to be very structured about which things we decide to do next and tracking them and sticking to the decisions we make. And that, I think, was also a very powerful element of the Los Alamos environment, which wasn't a natural environment of any of those people's lives before they got there.
in Oppenheimer's case, I think the thing that reinforced or even made possible his leadership role was that he did know as much and more about every detail of the project as everyone who was participating in it. So he had to develop that mastery of being unquestionably their greatest scientist, I suppose, something along those lines for that development, which was probably more from that scientific world that you would see, if someone was producing this remarkable output or seemed to understand something better, they would be in charge. And Oppenheimer found himself in a role where he kind of had to be in charge of all of it at once, and his mind was such that he was capable of doing that. His mind and his ambition. Unfortunately, I think most of us aren't Oppenheimer. I know I'm not. So I think you have to find a different model of leadership. And the person in the movie that they don't tell the story as they don't bring the story out is his next door neighbor and the leader of the theoretical division, Hans Bethe, who's one of the characters. He was a different style of leadership, softer and more cooperative. But at some point you do need that hard ass above you, which I think for most of the section heads it was convenient that they had some of the hardest people you could imagine in charge, Groves and Oppenheimer himself.
Yeah, well, and I like what you said, right? We're as leadership lessons that we can take away, right? We can't take away you should be Oppenheimer and be the most brilliant person in the building at all times. Like that's maybe not a life lesson that we can aspire to.
I
But
wish. Yeah.
yeah, great. Okay, that's my plan. Okay, I'm good, right? But the idea that you should take seriously everybody's individual discipline and learn as much about it as you can and be prepared to discuss it with them and be prepared to respect it as its own unique discipline, which he did by studying it, but it's maybe not the only way to do it, right? That idea that you can gain respect by engaging with people on their ground and acknowledging their expertise is certainly a lesson we can all take, right? That's a technique that we can take away.
That's the competency, right? And it doesn't have to be perfect in our world. And indeed, we're lucky that the people we're managing aren't developing new physics that nobody else in the world understands, but usually doing things that we do understand a little better. So lacking that, if you don't have that, if you're not willing to reach out and you're not willing to be compassionate to other people's challenges, you're not going to do a very good job. I think in our world, that compassion is what matters.
Yeah, so I think one little tactic that just as from a practical application perspective that I tend to use, and I'm sure you guys use it too, is okay, when you need to like lead really technical people in a certain direction or really highly skilled people, a lot of times those people, if you set yourself up with all of those people in the room all together to have a conversation, to move towards a decision or clarity or something like that, you a won't get the desired result, and B you won't even get that good of feedback, and you won't know if you're actually moving the right direction or not. It'll be unclear. So going and spending a little bit of time with those highly skilled technical people, that fits right into what you were saying about learning a little bit about their discipline, their knowledge. But it goes both ways. You spend a little bit of time, I'll go spend time with an architect, right, who's working on systems architecture, infrastructure, all that sort of stuff. Infrastructure, that's something that I don't know a whole lot about, but I learn. You just spend a little bit of time sitting with them and learning. And when you're there, it goes both ways. It's also about clarity, making sure, do they have clarity in exactly why we're doing what we're doing? Because in the architecture example, if you're talking about like technical architecture, IT architecture, a little bit of purpose and explanation of why and how is going to go a long way in making the little fine-grained details decisions about what tool to use for a certain part of the architecture. And it's going to help to make sure that that architecture is more future proof, and it's going to help the person to have more ownership. And so just spending that time, and I think we see that with Oppie, right? He goes off and he picks people off one by one and wants to make sure, like team by team, and wants to make sure he understands what that team is doing and how they're doing it, and that they trust that he understands it. And then he's also making sure they understand how it integrates with the bigger solution. That's really the job of the leader in that situation, where you have to be the integrator to get these different technical or different, again, not even just technical, but just different skill sets, people to work together towards one bigger solution.
Right. And that's how you end up with 14 meetings a day, right? Is that the people on the team need to have that individual attention in some cases, both so that they feel that their voices are heard and valued, but also because you can get a real sense, a real nuanced sense of their alignment to the purpose and their needs. And those are not things that you can get out of everybody talks for 30 seconds in a roundtable. Yeah, that's a really good point. I really like that, the practical application takeaway of like, yeah, go talk to your people one-on-one, listen to them, check in what they're saying, make sure that they understand the context of what they're doing and that they're collaborating with the right people. That's really cool.
I don't want to drag things in too different a direction than we've talked about, but the thing that occurs to me is that I see a conflict between the leadership style that is smartest guy in the room, which is sort of Oppenheimer and his scientists, and the leadership style that is more compassionate, I suppose, or more inclusive, leading through being the strongest and brightest, which later I think we talk about now in sort of a negative way as being the smartest guy in the room, right? That goal is I think maybe a bit of a dangerous one in a way, and that you do end up with this situation where just because someone has a great deal of technical ability or is indeed smarter than everybody else in the room doesn't necessarily mean they're going to make the best decisions if they can't also listen and think outside of maybe their own specialty.
Ooh, that's really good, Dave. I have a practical story about that recently. So, actually, I was working on my vision board, creating a dream board and goals and the art that goes along with that so that I can feel inspiration when I look at it and make sure that those emotions are aligned with where I'm going, whatever. So I was searching for an image that had to do with being a leader that empowers others because I don't. So I was using Dolly 3, the image generation AI model, to try to help me create some images and get some inspiration. And the images it was creating was like a guy in a suit standing in front of a crowd giving a speech or something like that. And it just doesn't feel right. It did not feel right at all.
We
Right.
have discovered algorithmic bias.
Exactly. Right. It's like, oh yeah, we need, yeah, that's exactly what it is. Right. It's like, okay, there's this very like stereotypical guy in a suit standing in front and everybody's clapping and they're happy. And that's what it thinks leadership is. And I was like, no, that's not what leadership is. And it occurred to me this morning while I was meeting with a mentor what leadership actually is. He was talking about another leader who I have a lot of respect for. I don't know him super well, but extremely compassionate guy. When he walks into the room, everything lights up. His name is Bishop Johnny. He is at one of the homeless ministry that we do. He lets us use his facility to be able to do that. And he's not there all the time. But this is what my friend was telling me. He was saying he shows up and he doesn't have to be there all the time because when he's there, he sets up. So he will work with some of our guests in this homeless ministry. And it literally solved my vision image problem when he described the way that Johnny sits with the guests. So he will take them upstairs after the meal and he will go up and he will make a U and he will sit in the center of the U and he will turn his way around the U and he will talk and ask questions and he will listen to each person. And he sits in the center so that it's not a classroom environment. It's not a speaking environment. He is building up people by understanding them better, by being there, by sitting next to them at their level with them. That's the type of leader that we want to be here. So I love what you said, Dave. It's like sometimes when we look at it, we're not here to criticize these people in these movies and stuff like that. That's not WonderTour reframes things rather than criticizes. But there is something to learn where you're like, okay, yeah, maybe that method isn't going to, maybe the method of being Oppie isn't going to work in my workplace. It isn't going to work in my family. It isn't going to work in my, nonprofit or whatever.
I think the hard part can be how to balance those two. Sometimes, we do see the use of quite a bit of hard power in the movie in terms of, tough decision making by traditional sort of tough my way or the highway leaders. But somehow we also know that that's not the whole story. It's not the whole story in the movie for sure, but it's also maybe not something that we think about so much. It's not something that's obvious until you present yourself with that question. Well, why can't I be Oppenheimer? Well, I'm not going to be that guy. But what can we do to be more effective? I mean, how can we learn these other skills? Because The story about you said Bishop Johnny, right? Is that did I
Yeah.
get the name right? He strikes me as the sort that is a different kind of Oppenheimer, but a sort of a moral or a genius of another sort that people recognize. That his authority comes from something moral, and other people recognize that. And that is, I mean, certainly we can study and learn to be smarter, but maybe we can also study and learn to be more compassionate.
Well, I'm sure there's something in there, right, about the leadership style has to be appropriate to the context, to the people that you're leading, and the kind of thing that you're trying to accomplish as an organization, to the higher purpose, right? You said not just the goal, but the purpose. And that's very. There are a lot of different kinds of organizations. There's a lot of different kinds of people that you might be placed in a leadership role relative to, and being amidst a group of volunteers or being amidst a group of people that just need help is a very different environment than being amidst a group of hyper motivated people with an existential crisis, right? So there, all these techniques are good to know about, because the reason we do this, the reason we have these discussions on WonderTour, is to have mental models of, oh, this is the kind of situation I'm in, this is the kind of skillful response that might work for me. And so I love having the Bishop Johnny mental image of like sitting at the same level or lower in the middle of a group and engaging with them one at a time is a very different mental model than standing up in the pulpit and expostulating. Right. So that's very cool. Thanks, Drew. So do we want to start wrapping up with our takeaways here, Drew? Do you think we got some good ones out of this one?
Oh yeah, definitely some good ones, and not necessarily what I was expecting when we started out. We did hit everything that we wanted to hit here in terms of our theme, designing an organization to pursue a purpose. I think we talked a little bit about each one of those things, but as always with WonderTour, we kind of say that we're going on a journey. We're going on a hike. We're climbing a mountain, and it's a new mountain that we haven't climbed before each time. And the journey's different because, today I'm going on the journey with Brian and Dave and with all the characters and creators of Oppenheimer. And next week we'll be going on a journey with some different folks on a different mountain. But coming back down, for me, one of the best parts of the hike is just talking about it. What did we see? What did we learn? How did we grow? What are we going to do differently? And again, this everybody's experience of a hike is a little bit different. But coming down here, some of the things that I take away, number one, we talk about this a bit on different episodes of WonderTour, but clarity and competency. That to have a really effective organization, whether you're leading a team, trying to influence a community around you, your family, whatever it is, clarity and competency is the key. And this is from David Marquet. He says that you need to have enough clarity so that people can act in alignment with each other. Again, they don't have to be perfectly aligned, but the clarity will help them to integrate and work together. And they have to have enough competency to be able to make the right decisions. That's how we make really good human beings. Or make is a tough term there, but that's how we help to cultivate great human beings.
Cultivate. I like cultivate.
Yeah, cultivate. Exactly. We like
Absolutely.
those garden terminology, right?
Yes.
Number two, the best way to move quickly is to create high performing teams. And that's what we see here as well. Whether it's Oppenheimer or Groves, they both understand that via their past experience. They have very different experience in building organizations, but they are well aware that the best way to move quickly is to create high performing teams. We see this obviously with the SEAL teams, as most people would consider like the premier teams in the world. These US Navy SEAL teams that are able to do unthinkable things, impossible things, and they do it not through individual feats of strength or fortitude or anything like that, but by working together. So their exercises are focused, when you read about their journey, about working together. That's what we want to do within our organizations. We also talked about the kind of transparency and vulnerability to break down the silos, and the need to consider, what compartmentalization is required versus what compartmentalization are we going to have to sacrifice in order to achieve the desired result. So when you're making an organization or you're influencing the direction an organization goes, whether it's an org chart or, like Brian was saying, more like of a virtual org chart where how are the connections supposed to look, who's supposed to work together on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis, I think heavy consideration should be making sure that there's transparency as much as possible, while compartmentalizing where there is secret information or competitive advantage or something, just long enough to gain that edge. And this was really key. Now we're getting to the good stuff. You can't just decide to be Oppenheimer, but you can really learn and respect the knowledge and the skill of the people around you. You can seek to learn and understand and not be the expert on each of the teams that Oppenheimer managed, but to be there with the team, to help them to integrate, to provide that clarity, to make sure they have the competency that they need to perform the task. We talked about talking to people one-on-one in order to be able to do that. As one technique that you can have that goes two ways, where talking to somebody one-on-one gives you an understanding of how much clarity and alignment they have, how integrated they are with the mission and the vision. And of course, also it helps you to better understand them and build trust with them so that they're able to, feel more empowered to make the decisions to move the mission forward. And then lastly, we talked about how Oppenheimer isn't the only model of a leader that can lead a successful initiative, that can lead a transformative program. That there's different times where you don't need to be the highly skilled technical person who jumps into every discussion and makes the tough decisions. And no, there's other times where you need to be the compassionate Bishop Johnny that sits in the middle of the group and listens to somebody and understands them and shows them that you care about them, because that changes lives just as much, perhaps more.
Absolutely. Well, and knowing when to switch, right? Or knowing how to bring all of those things in is something I know I'm working on.
Oh, and I assure you, Bishop Johnny has, knowing him, again, not super well, but well enough. He has other modes that he goes into, but he's very skilled at knowing what mode to go into based on what audience in order to achieve the desired result. And the effect is such that when he walks into the room, somehow you notice that he walked into the room. You're like, oh, Bishop Johnny wasn't here before. But literally I felt him behind me enter the room. And isn't that the definition of the type of leader that we're trying to be?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to take that thought and work towards it. I love that.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, and I think with the first couple points you made about the clarity and moving quickly and transparency, just to kind of box all that up, like the mental image of the Los Alamos of like, what can I do that will get my team into a physical and mental and emotional information space that they can really be maximally productive, that they're talking to the people they need to talk to, that they've got support, they've got collaboration, and they have minimal interference. Whatever you can do to give them that space is a gift to a creative, intellectual, hardworking person, right? Is the opportunity to just go be amazing at something and be confident that they're supported and be confident that they're aligned with not just a goal, but a purpose.
Beautiful.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dave. This has been great. Really appreciate you bringing in your subject knowledge on the matter, your passion, enthusiasm, your just general interest in WonderTour and leadership. It is always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much. I'm a big fan, and I'm glad that to ride along for this one.
All right. Well, you're WonderTour core now, so thank you for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this episode as well. We're excited for next episode. We're going to be wrapping up our human-machine interaction series with a classic from the Marvel canon about another person who thinks he's the smartest one in the room. But we're going all the way back to the Robert Downey Jr. original Iron Man. So looking forward to that for episode 109. But in the meantime, thanks again for joining us. We hope you got something out of this to chew on over the next week or so. And just remember, as always, character is destiny.